Welcome everyone, I'm Vega, and today we're here to discuss Matt Bell's A Tree or a Person or a Wall from the perspective of an English major reader and writer.
Hey y'all, my name's Dex. We've decided to tackle a tree or a person or a wall from a blended angle, incorporating what we've learned of craft as authors ourselves and how we read as English majors. We've chosen a few stories from this collection to focus on while weaving in perspectives from reviews of Matt Bell's collection and his 2021 novel, Appleseed.
To start us off in a review, Kurt Baumeister says that the structure of A Tree or a Person or a Wall feels at once like an early career retrospective and a unified piece of work. Baumeister goes on to discuss how the stories are not necessarily linked, but in my opinion, in a lot of ways, they are. The organization in 7 separate sections works, melding old and new work together. These sections find either thematic or stylistic ways to connect. From themes of grief and mental health to stylistic elements such as repetition and the asking of ruminating questions to portray mental state. Some of them bleed together in plot, feeling connected even though they are supposedly not. Like the title story, A Tree or Person or a Wall, merging with doll parts to create the perception of a connected narrative.
Just as like a general note, I love literary fiction, but sometimes in the genre things can get a little flowery. Bell riffs on his themes even within the white space on the page. The simplicity of it all, seemingly meaningless words puzzle pieced together intentionally to curate a theme that's intricate enough to span across so many stories in vastly different ways while speaking to the same human experience. Grief, as one theme in Doll Parts, feels tangible in the most abstract way. Liminal, uncanny, inevitable, and obsessive.
And I think that kind of simplicity lends itself to such deep emotional gut punches within the work, which Baumeister describes as simultaneously elegant and muscular. I found muscular to be a fascinating word for it and a perfect way to describe the prose of this collection. It's strong. At times it can be punchy, and it aims to hit you where it hurts, to crawl under the skin and stick there. The simplicity of the language lends a sense of power into what is being said. Specific sentences like, he climbs the spiral of the stairs one slow step at a time, trying not to look down, not to see the end of the world trapped in the boy's eyes, and a long walk with only chalk to mark the way, and no matter how hard he tries to hide it, he will not speak the same language others speak, in a certain number of bedrooms, encapsulate this type of prose. The bare bones aspect of these sentences are what make them hit.
I'm so glad you brought that up. The revelations in these stories are told with this tone of dilution, stripping down the prose to only what you need as a reader. I'm a poet, and this prose feels the way poetry feels to me. It's approachable and vivid, even in its nakedness. Hank Stevenson describes Bell's writing as doom-inflicted poetics in his review of A Tree or a Person or a Wall, and I can't help but pull directly from A Long Walk with Only Chalk to Mark the Way too in my support of that description. Quote, when he held up the boy's boots, the father felt as he always did when he bought the boy clothes. How could the boy be this small and still be in so much danger? End quote. Bell's ability to depict a parent's grief as their child is dying in front of them, someone as innocent and small as a child, one that the parent is supposed to protect, to watch them, to still care for them while they die. It's a devastatingly tender and solemn experience to witness from the page.
It feels very nuts and bolts. It strips the language down to its most fundamental components. There are no frills, there's no bullshit. It gets to the very core of these themes, and even in its approachability, it leaves the reader with questions. So many of my annotations will stop after a sentence and be like, so is this a nudge to insert mental health issue or blank theme? It's so insanely different from the lyrical, deep, and incredibly descriptive prose in Appleseed. Both modes evoke emotion, but Bell approaches Appleseed by going deep into his bag with language, with passages like, quote, abundance everywhere, everywhere gathering in joy and predation and sorrow. Amid all this untamed splendor, every acre of forest is an empire in the shape of the world, end quote.
The dichotomy of a character's purpose from A Tree or a Person or a Wall to Appleseed is genuinely baffling. I continue to be awestruck at Bell's ability to go from a character's value is garnered only from their role in relation to other characters in A Tree or a Person or a Wall to flipping that convention entirely on its head in Appleseed. He paints starkly different portraits of grief and hope. Within a loss or an absence, characters lose themselves in these stories as they're suspended in a life without the presence of a driving force in their stories. But when we speak to hope, everything is named, detailed, observed, and witnessed, and exists with purpose and home. It's laced through the fibers of every part of everything. Quote, by day's end, he will have planted 200 seeds in near rows, each stringy with pulp and pomace, each given its own hole, each hole mounded over by a scooped handful of black dirt. It's such a simple act, producing such a complex being, sprout and root, trunk and branch, leaf and flower and fruit unfolding. End quote. Nothing goes unnoticed in Appleseed. But it makes me wonder how many unreliable narrators we might have working within the stories of a tree or a person or a wall.
Okay, 2 points I want to make to all of this. We'll start with that namelessness, that placelessness of a tree or a person or a wall, and how it helps to lend a sort of universality to the stories. Since giving a character a name can sometimes take away some of that thematic universality and instead overspecify a character, as they come to be defined by their name or some physical trait of theirs. While Belle writes with nuance, by the end of the story you're able to say, wow, this is about how children internalize and externalize their grief and the development of their reactions to events and the escalation of their mental conditions. This is especially apparent in Dull Parts, where the loss of the sister sibling causes her compulsions to intensify, while also holding a mirror up to her mother's anxiety. Then, in Appleseed, we see how intentional the naming of the characters and places is, and how it grounds us in a world that is very, very specific. It makes us feel that only these characters can live here, doing these very specific things. And since this is a book that spans 3 timelines, this is particularly true of Nathaniel and Chapman's sections. And what I am speaking to in this pod is their section. It's all about specificity with Appleseed, and how that specificity inspires the hope laced through the novel. No pun intended, but the depth of characterization in Appleseed makes us want to root for these characters.
Staying in line with the convention of planting the seeds of character identity, no pun intended, in the receiving tower, characters with names don't know who they are, what makes them them, while characters who are referred to only by their roles, like the sister in Dull Parts or the ape in the title story, they're more specifically defined and secure to the reader, even without a name. Appleseed plays with the naming convention by narrowing down purpose within the isolated context of the story. The hope exists here because action is productive and rewarding. I'm thinking specifically about the stations here, where we're seeing a tug of war between the panic disorder of a child and the avoidance or neglect of the mother. As readers, when we see those titles placed onto these characters, we come into the story with an immediate expectation as to how those characters should act. When those assumptions are disproven, we're left wondering why those titles were held so closely by the characters in the first place. Who are they? Why are they?
I think this actually brings up an important notation of character motivation. As writers, we're taught that the reader needs to understand a character's motivation in order to follow them through the story. But even that convention is broken within a tree or a person or a wall. In the receiving tower, because of the amnesia component of the story, the reader is left to wonder what the exact motivation of keeping the men trapped long past the war is. However, in a story like The Stations, it's clear as day that the little boy is motivated by his mother's perceived neglect of him, her inability to answer his questions, a place where repetition is a well-used plot device because it deepens this motivation. But in Appleseed, there is absolutely no missing the motivation of the brothers, even from the first few pages. They want to plant their trees. They need to. Their want for advancement in this beautiful land they speak of is undeniably what they're after.
We're taught as writers, too, that your through lines, your language, and your dialogue, if you should choose to use it, should propel your story by riffing on theme. I think Professor Rabine may be in these walls. Bell takes a holistic approach with these concepts that could stand well on their own, but he takes them and pretzel twists them 50 different ways, and it works. In stories like A Certain Number of Bedrooms, we grapple with home as the boy grapples with the loss of his mother by suicide. How do you rebuild a home without a mother? How do you move on from the last place you saw your mother alive? Duncan B. Barlow reviewed the title story, making the observation that the boy in the story had to, quote, accept his fate as piece of a terrible repeating cycle, end quote, which ends up being the fate of many characters within Bell's collection. In A Long Walk with Only Chalk to Mark the Way, the father stops searching for life or death, quote, marking neither the way forward nor the way back, offering only the fact that once he and the boy had been there, end quote. With the nuance that Bell writes into the experience of these characters, named or otherwise, he challenges us to reimagine and redefine the motivations of these characters with every fictitious depiction of the human experience.
Very well said. And I am going to latch onto a specific part of this and talk about dialogue, because I'm so glad you brought up the importance of that. And I've been dying to talk about it. I don't know if you noticed, but Bell uses no quotation marks to define dialogue in any of the stories, in a tree or a person or a wall. I found this curious, as it's a very specific stylistic choice that can easily lead to confusion if one is reading too quickly, or in my opinion, it can kind of serve to depersonalize an aspect of fiction writing that is crucial to character and deeply personal to how a character externalizes their exterior. We're taught so much about the importance of dialogue and how critical it being properly written, I put in air quotes, is. There isn't much dialogue here to begin with, as it isn't always needed in these stories, since the interior of the characters is so laid out on the page through their thoughts and their emotions. We have the boy in the stations thinking about how he lied to the mother about the threat of violence, and the girl in doll parts thinking that in eating her hair, she could accomplish a task at hand. So, when dialogue is used, you'd expect it to stand out significantly, to be explicitly placed, and marked with quotation marks. I will say, I do have a little insider information on this point from Matt Bell himself. As during the Bonderman workshop, he explained that many of the stories were written during his MFA thesis, and he has since gone back to the convention of using quotation marks. It's an interesting convention to me to abandon, especially as an MFA student, and something that's very daring, in my opinion, to do, even though I don't necessarily think it always works. And while I say I don't think it always works, I don't think that here. I think here it's very intentional, and it's meant to kind of, what word am I looking for? It's meant to keep us focused on the interior of the character, because it seems to Bell that the interior is so much more important than the exterior, even though we do see him balance those in some of the stories.
Thank you for being our spy on the inside, Vega. Your dedication to the cause is greatly appreciated.
You know me.
That is a really interesting convention to abandon, though, but we both know firsthand how rewarding it is to challenge yourself as an author to consciously decide against something that has become like a reflex or part of your voice. I think even in terms of the way that we write characters, we can sometimes rely too heavily on what you were speaking to earlier, like appearance or dialogue to illustrate our characters and not behaviors or motivations. It's a weird method of depersonalization, like you noted, with the lack of quotation marks, and Bell uses it strategically. He keeps us focused and on track. Our characters can adopt rituals with what we offer them, like the sister in Doll Parts. Her grief for her brother holds hands with the trauma in her body that her brother put there, but she loses herself in the identity that she gains in the loss of her brother. The doll that her mother crafts to replace him becomes an icon that represents her just as much as her physical self does. We're told that, quote, without the doll dragging behind her, banging into everything she passed, the sister was almost invisible. Returning with the sharp scissors in her hands, she was still something no one was trying to see. End quote. I mean, come on. The kid is literally eating the stuffing from the body of her pseudo-brother. That's uncanny as shit. It's freaky and weird, and her brother isn't even explicitly proven to be dead. But he isn't physically present to give her physical attention, isn't near her, isn't touching her. So he may as well be dead.
It really is crazy with that story in particular, and what we see in some of the other stories, the interior making itself exterior. It's the definition of what happens inside, giving meaning to the actions on the outside, which we learn in fiction writing is incredibly important. It's a masterclass in using all the tools in the writerly toolbox to make your reader understand that this little girl is so traumatized. She's so impacted by her brother's death / disappearance, whatever it is, because we never quite learn, even though the found arm and all that stuff, that she is essentially being controlled by her interior. She's unable to get a handle or control on her behaviors because not only is she lost in her grief, we have to remember that she is a child who does not know how to control said behaviors. It's compelling because it balances these two modes in the most extreme way possible, where 2 + 2 = 4 because, duh, she's eating her hair to try to gain a sense of control because her brother, the only person who she thought cared about her at all, is gone. We see that in the quote that you used, actually, where her parents basically ignore her. She doesn't exist to them, but her brother was the person giving her attention, giving her love, even in its twisted kind of way. But, to switch gears, and yet again to be the man on the inside, I was very interested in something Belle said at the Ryberg reading about the receiving tower. I saw this very peripherally as a mystery, but apparently editors wanted a solving of the mystery of why the soldiers were trapped in the tower and who was behind it. But Belle wanted to focus on the amnesia of it all, so we solved the mystery in the middle and then kept going. So, initially, I put the story in our discussion list because it felt like one that most devoutly followed convention. But it turns out that while it reads that way, I was wrong. And it is actually unconventional because who usually solves the mystery in the middle? Not really anyone. It set off a light bulb in my head that even though it reads how I'm used to a short story reading, I still got duped and convention was broken after all.
With both doll parts and the receiving tower, we have unreliable narrators that I kind of mentioned earlier. I mean, a kid is going to be an unreliable narrator. The perspective of a child is so much different than the cognitive, processing that an adult can do within a story. But I have to be honest, I really didn't like the receiving tower. It just felt so regular, comparatively. I like weird shit. I was stuck wondering why I was being told things that I hadn't been told in any of the other stories that I'd read, and I felt an imbalance rather than that balance that you're speaking to with doll parts. I mean, the loss of self was pretty in your face, but it was jarring to go from someone losing their role by the end of their story to reading about people who only had names to begin with. A Long Walk with Only Chalk to Mark the Way shows us this whittled down version of a character whose entire purpose in the story was to watch his son die. To, lead him to death. The line, quote, "The name father taken from him, the name husband longer gone," end quote, spun this non-naming convention in a way that I hadn't really thought of before. Who are these characters in relation to time? How many iterations of grief have they experienced? We end this story and the entire collection of a tree or a person or a wall with the dutiful acceptance of, quote, "the terrible freedom of the last survivor," end quote. I want that hope that Appleseed would give me. Survivors are supposed to be hopeful. Time doesn't stop here for the survivors in these stories. So what are we supposed to assume comes from the injustice in this grief?
We're gonna get to that last bit that you just said, but I need to say that I think that's what I liked about the receiving tower. That we finally have a set of names, and even then the names don't matter. And the people are still defined by their roles. As soldier, as captain, as a member of the listening room. There is a sense that it's doomed if you do have a name, and it's doomed if you don't. Moon being given identity through his name doesn't in reality give him anything. It's just a name. Because even within it, he does not know who he is, because his brain is incapable of letting him know, since he is now an amnesiac. But to discuss A Long Walk with Only Chalk to Mark the Way, we have a story that follows the convention of the plotline, except the ending remains unhappy. The break in convention remains in the namelessness, and it maintains its universality in thinking that this is a sort of grief that is inescapable, the loss of a very young son after already losing the wife. What's also interesting about that story is that there are more questions than the ones you pose about grief. What is the son's condition? Why don't we find that out? Is it just to remain universal in the idea of sickness versus giving said sickness a name? Then we see the mother serve a dual purpose. one of an angel or an omen of death, and the other as a manifestation of the father's grief when he meets her on the rooftop and begs, "Please tell me what to do. I can't let him be trapped here too." He speaks to us as this last survivor, lets us know that it's an inescapable sort of hell that we could see reflected in ourselves if the circumstances just played themselves out in a certain way. And honestly, I'm not always looking for hope. This collection speaks to the side of me that is a glutton for pain, someone who wants to see the ways that I think about grief and don't necessarily say out loud or write on the page, stuck in my face anyways. It's not always about hope. Sometimes we need to flip the other side of the coin and dive into the darker angles, as the Matt Bell reviewers like to call them.
It's interesting to see the juggling that Matt Bell does with grief and trauma and memory. They're all held together while being so separate. They're revolving parts and moving pieces, dynamic aspects of these stories that they play into each other, but they can exist on their own. And not to be that English major, but Shakespeare wrote something pretty relevant in terms of names in Romeo and Juliet. Quote, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." End quote. Names are just names. What the boy is sick with doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter that we don't get that answer. His fate is death regardless. It could be the common cold or it could be cancer. It's suspended in perspective. But it's not just about perspective with names either. It's about power. What is worth naming? You could bargain with death without naming the thing doing the killing, and it has the same chance of saving a life that naming the harbinger of death would. There's no fairness in death. There's no justice in grief, but there can be a fair reclamation of power if you choose to give a name to the killing thing. We're not given a name because we're owed one. We're given a name when we need one.
Okay, poet. You successfully shut me up here. Because what the hell am I even supposed to say to that? I guess that my option is to pivot away from that last couple of doom and gloom words I just said and try to end us on a lighter, more hopeful note, because we unfortunately do have to wrap this beautiful time we're having up. To tie us back into a tree or a person or a wall, we see a sense of liminality where in Appleseed we are instead grounded in hope, as the following quote signifies to the reader. "Wherever Chapman does not plant or plow, native abundance persists. Hundreds of miles of virgin forest lie in every direction. Surely enough free woods will always exist for every displaced creature to find a new home. Surely the world Nathaniel aims to build can coexist alongside the world given and grown. Or so Chapman hopes. From these seeds will grow enough seedlings for Nathaniel to supply 6 families. 6 ready husbands and their brave wives, and whatever squalling children are already born. The first of the many each man and woman might wish to have. The multitudes necessary to settle the continent. 30 trees for each family, bought from enterprising Nathaniel, and used to better secure their legal claim to whatever plot of cleared land each family has chosen to build a cabin, over whose door they might hang an oil lamp to light the unbearable dark of the Ohioan woods." Now let's pretend I'm dropping the mic and let's bid farewell to the people. Thanks for listening, everyone. Over and out.